In a charged atmosphere of intolerance, a woman notorious for her prejudice told a black man, "Go back to Africa." But his stunning comeback silenced the crowd and turned the tide on a tale of hate. The surface of the supermarket seemed to freeze. As Daryl broke the silence, his voice steady despite the fury building inside him. "The Senora has idea of what she just said?" he asked, staring directly at Susan, whose blonde hair and designer clothes stood in stark contrast to his simple blue hoodie and jeans. 20 feet away, other shoppers pretended to browse produce while stealing glances at the confrontation. An elderly man with a cap watched with concerned eyes. A young mother pulled her child closer. The air felt charged, dangerous. "I said exactly what I meant to say," Susan replied, her voice echoing through the unnaturally quiet store. "This is my country. People like you should know your place." Daryl clutched his shopping basket tighter, his knuckles whitening. The taste of injustice was metallic in his mouth. The store's distant lights seemed to dim as blood rushed to his ears. "My grandfather fought in World War II, he said, his voice breaking slightly. "When he came home, he couldn't even use the same bathrooms as the white soldiers he fought alongside." A small gasp came from behind the fruit display. Daryl turned to see a store employee frozen in place, a box of apples suspended in midair. In that moment, with all eyes upon him, Daryl realized that his response to Susan's hatred would define not just this encounter, but perhaps something much larger than himself. 5 years earlier, Daryl Johnson had been a different person. At 23, he'd been focused on finishing his business degree, working nights at his father's auto repair shop, and planning a future that seemed straightforward and attainable. Until the day everything changed. It was a routine traffic stop on his way home from night classes. Daryl had seen the flashing lights in his rearview mirror and felt the familiar knot of anxiety form in his stomach, the same feeling his father had warned him about since he was 16. "Keep your hands visible," James Johnson had instructed his son the day he got his license. "Speak respectfully. Move slowly. No matter what they say or do, remember that getting home safe is all that matters." Daryl had followed those instructions to the letter that night. He'd pulled over promptly, kept his hands on the steering. Wheel answered yes sir and no sir to the officer's questions. But somehow it still went wrong. "You match the description of someone we're looking for," the officer had said, though he wouldn't elaborate on what description or who they were seeking. What followed was Daryl being ordered out of his car, handcuffed, and made to sit on the curb while officers searched his vehicle without consent. They found nothing because there was nothing to find, but the damage had been done. Passing cars slowed to stare. Neighbors peeked through curtains. Daryl, despite having done nothing wrong, felt shame burn through him as he sat displayed like a criminal. After an hour, they released him with a mumbled non-apology and a warning for a broken taillight that wasn't actually broken. When he told his parents what happened, his mother, Patricia, a long-time elementary school teacher respected throughout the community, had wept silently. His father had simply nodded, the lines around his eyes deepening. "It's not right," Daryl had raged, pacing their modest living room. "I should file a complaint. I should tell someone." "And who would believe you?" his father had asked quietly. "Who would take your word over theirs?" The resignation in his father's voice had struck Daryl like a physical blow. James Johnson was a proud man, a skilled mechanic who had built his business from nothing, who stayed late to help customers, who couldn't afford full repairs, who coached Little League on weekends. To hear defeat in his voice was unbearable, but Patricia had straightened in her chair, wiping away tears. "There are two ways to fight injustice," she'd said, her teacher's voice emerging. "There's the loud way with shouting and anger. Sometimes that's necessary. But there's also the way of dignity and truth. That's harder, but it changes minds." Daryl hadn't been convinced. He'd spent weeks feeling bitter, powerless, violated. He'd considered dropping out of school, wondering what the point was of working so hard in a system stacked against him. Then came the career fair at his university. Daryl had attended half-heartedly until he spotted a booth for a community advocacy program, a non-profit that worked with disadvantaged youth, teaching them their rights, providing mentorship, offering paths forward other than the streets. The director, an older black woman named Dr. Eleanor Wilkins, had spoken about systemic change through education and presence. We. I need people who understand, she'd told him, who've lived it, who can speak truth to power but also show these kids a better way forward. Something had clicked for Daryl in that moment. By the end of the day, he'd signed up to volunteer. By the end of the semester, he'd shifted his business classes to include a minor in social justice. By graduation, he'd accepted a full-time position with the program. The work wasn't easy. He faced resistance not just from the system, but sometimes from the very communities he was trying to help, people so accustomed to broken promises that they viewed his optimism with suspicion. But slowly, case by case, child by child, he began to make a difference. He taught teenagers how to navigate police encounters safely while maintaining their dignity. He helped parents advocate for their children in schools that were quick to punish and slow to support. He organized community forums where residents could speak directly to local officials about their concerns, and he learned something crucial. Meaningful change rarely came from shouting the loudest, but from speaking truth in spaces where it couldn't be ignored or dismissed, which was exactly what he was trying to do now, standing in the produce section of an upscale supermarket, facing a woman whose casual hatred revealed a much deeper American disease. We should be better than this, Daryl said firmly, meeting Susan's glare without flinching. The confrontation had escalated when Susan, seeing Daryl shopping in what she clearly considered her neighborhood market, had loudly suggested he go back to Africa, and that people like him didn't belong here. Now the entire store was watching, the routine of grocery shopping suspended as something far more significant unfolded between the fruit displays and refrigerated cases. My family has been in this country for generations, Daryl continued, his voice steady but carrying throughout the silent store. My great-grandfather was born in Mississippi. His father was enslaved, taken from his homeland, separated from his family, treated like property, all to build this country, the same country where you're now telling me I don't belong. Susan's stance had shifted slightly, her crossed arms now seeming more defensive than defiant. Her eyes darted to the other shoppers, perhaps looking for support but finding none. My grandfather fought for this country in World War II, Daryl went on. When he came home, he couldn't use the same facilities as white veterans. He didn't have equal rights, but he stayed because he believed in what America could be, not what it was at that moment. The store was completely silent now. A cashier had stopped scanning items. The manager, who had been approaching to intervene, stood frozen in the aisle, listening. My mother teaches second grade. She spent 30 years helping children, all children, regardless of their skin color or where they come from. My father is a mechanic who's probably fixed hundreds of cars like yours. If you broke down on the side of the road, he'd be the first person to stop and help you. No questions asked. Daryl gestured to his simple blue hoodie and jeans. You look at me and see someone who doesn't belong, but I look at you and see someone who's forgotten what this country is supposed to stand for. A murmur of agreement rippled through the onlookers. The older man with the cap nodded firmly. He's right, he said, his voice breaking the spectator silence. We need to be better than this. A woman near the frozen food section added, My father fought in Vietnam. He always said the only color that mattered was the red, white, and blue of our flag. Susan's face had flushed crimson. She gripped her shopping cart tightly, knuckles white against the metal handle. I didn't mean, she started, but her voice trailed off. Daryl didn't press his advantage. There was no victory in humiliating her. It's not about what you meant to say, he told her gently. It's about what your words actually mean, the impact they have. Words matter, but actions matter even more. The silence that followed was broken by a single sound, applause. First from the older man, then from the young mother, then spreading until the entire store was clapping. Susan, clearly mortified, pushed her cart toward the exit without completing her shopping. As she fled, several people approached Daryl, thanking him for speaking up. What you said, the young cashier told him as she bagged his groceries later, was incredible. I don't think I would have had that courage. Daryl smiled slightly as he took his bags. Sometimes the best way to fight hate isn't with more anger but with truth, As he walked to his car in the fading evening light, Darryl thought about calling his parents to tell them what had happened. His mother would be proud of how he'd handled it. His father might shake his head and say that Susan wouldn't really change. They'd both be right in their own ways. Change didn't happen in dramatic moments. It happened in the quiet space after, when words had time to sink in and take root. Maybe Susan would dismiss the encounter as soon as she got home. Or maybe, just maybe, something he said would linger, causing her to question assumptions she'd never examined before. Either way, Darryl had spoken his truth, not with rage or retaliation, but with the quiet dignity his mother had taught him was the most powerful weapon against ignorance. In doing so, he'd turned a moment of ugliness into one of unexpected community, as strangers united around a simple idea. We can be better than this. And for now, that was enough. 3 months later, Darryl was leading a workshop at the community center when he spotted a familiar face in the back row. Susan sat stiffly in her chair, looking uncomfortable but determined as he spoke about implicit bias and community building. When the session ended, most participants gathered around the refreshment table, but Susan approached him directly, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her chest like armor. "You probably don't remember me," she began. "I remember," Darryl replied simply. Susan nodded, swallowing hard. "After what happened at the store, I couldn't stop thinking about what you said about words and their impact." She paused, visibly struggling. "My daughter found out what I did. She was horrified, said she was ashamed of me." Darryl remained silent, letting her continue. "I've never seen my child look at me that way," Susan said, her voice cracking slightly. "It made me realize I needed to do better. So I've been trying to educate myself, coming to these workshops, reading books I should have read years ago." She gestured around the community center. "Listening more than talking. That's a good start," Darryl acknowledged. "I know it doesn't erase what I said," Susan continued, "and I'm not asking for forgiveness or a pat on the back for basic decency. I just wanted you to know that your words that day, they mattered. They changed something." Darryl considered her for a moment, recognizing the courage it must have taken for her to come here, to face him. "Change is uncomfortable," he said finally, "but it's also how we grow." Susan nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Oh, your mother, the teacher you mentioned, she must be very proud of you." Darryl smiled. "She believes words can change the world, one conversation at a time." "I think she might be right," Susan said quietly. As they stood there in the community center, surrounded by people from all walks of life working toward understanding, Darryl thought about how a single moment in a grocery store had created ripples neither of them could have predicted. Words had weight. They could wound, but they could also heal. They could divide, but they could also bring together. And sometimes, in the most unexpected places, between the produce and the frozen, foods between strangers from different worlds, they could begin to bridge the divides that seemed impossible to cross.